The pilots who rose into the Pacific sky during the final years of the global conflict understood that each ascent might carve their names into either triumph or oblivion. Yet even among the countless engines that thundered across those distant horizons, one machine carried an aura that felt almost elemental, as though the heavens themselves had forged it. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt did not glide with the grace of a dancer, nor did it slice the air with the elegant sharpness of a duelist's blade. Instead, it arrived like an oncoming tempest, immense, roaring, and wrapped in an unyielding sheath of steel. To many Japanese airmen who witnessed its approach, it resembled not merely an opponent, but a force of nature that announced itself through fire, smoke, and shattering percussion. On the ground below, soldiers stared upward with the same mixture of dread and awe. Trails of incandescent tracers raked through the air, as though a burning storm swept down from the upper atmosphere. A single pass from the Thunderbolt could uproot encampments, shatter ammunition stores, and tear apart aircraft before they even reached the runway. Survivors spoke of its arrival with a trembling reverence, as though they had glimpsed a living embodiment of the war's escalating ferocity. Within this maelstrom of steel and thunder, a single Japanese pilot named Lieutenant Masaru Hayashi found his fate intertwined with the growing legend of the Thunderbolt. He had risen through the ranks during the early years of the conflict, when confidence filled every briefing room and victory felt inevitable. Now he watched a new enemy dominate the sky with overwhelming force, and he struggled to reconcile the world he had known with the relentless storm that had risen against it. His story begins in that unsteady space between duty, fear, and the dawning realization that a single machine could reshape an entire theater of war. Lieutenant Masaru Hayashi had once believed that the sky itself favored him. During his early training flights, when the conflict still carried an air of certainty for his nation, he experienced a sense of effortless mastery. He felt that the sunlit clouds opened pathways only he could see, and that his Mitsubishi fighter responded to his touch with unwavering loyalty. Senior officers praised his instincts, younger pilots admired his fearlessness, and he imagined a future shaped by bold ascents and triumphant returns. The war, as he understood it then, felt like a vast stage upon which courage alone could influence destiny. However, as the seasons turned and the conflict widened, that confidence began to fracture. New American aircraft entered the theater with unsettling frequency, each one forged with greater speed, greater resilience, and greater firepower. Reports drifted across briefing tables, describing engines that refused to falter, armor that shrugged off small-caliber rounds, and formations that operated with a precision his own unit struggled to match. Masaru continued to fly with determination, but he sensed a shifting current beneath every mission, a quiet warning that the balance he had once taken for granted was beginning to tilt. The moment of emotional reversal arrived without ceremony. His squadron scrambled one humid morning to intercept what they believed to be a routine patrol of American fighters. Yet as Masaru climbed toward the glinting shapes above, he saw not the familiar silhouettes of earlier engagements, but immense, broad-winged machines whose presence pushed the air aside with overpowering force. Their engines thundered as though entire storms had been confined within metal shells. He watched tracers arc between them in tightly controlled bursts, each line of fire precise, unhurried, and devastating. His unit's attack dissolved almost instantly. The first pass from the American formation tore through Japanese aircraft with a brutality Masaru had never witnessed. His closest wingman vanished in a bloom of flame, erased before Masaru could even call out. The Thunderbolts swung through the sky with relentless weight, their guns stitching molten paths across the clouds. In that instant, Masaru felt something break within him. The sky, once his realm of confidence, became a place of dread. His earlier certainty, built upon youthful pride and national momentum, collapsed beneath the realization that a new power ruled the heavens. The war he had imagined could be shaped by courage alone had transformed into a struggle against a machine that seemed to command the elements themselves. When Lieutenant Masaru Hayashi finally stepped through the gate of his family home, the world seemed to exhale around him. The garden he had once tended as a young boy lay overgrown, yet sunlight filtered gently through the tangled leaves, casting soft patterns across the worn stones. His mother emerged from the doorway with hesitant steps, as though fearing that the figure before her might dissolve into memory. When she recognized him, she embraced him with a depth of emotion only years of uncertainty could shape. His sister followed, her eyes filled with both joy and sorrow. Masaru felt the warmth of their presence anchor him in a way no battlefield ever had. Life, after the war, unfolded slowly. The enormous weight of loss lingered in every household, every street, and every gathering. Survivors carried invisible burdens, and families spoke in quiet tones about those who would never return. Masaru assisted his mother with the small tasks of daily living, repaired what he could around the home, and offered support to neighbors who struggled to rebuild their fractured lives. Through each act, he learned that resilience did not depend upon machines, strategies, or national ambition. It depended upon the gentle persistence of ordinary people who continued forward despite the shadows that followed them. In time, Masaru returned to the skies, not as a soldier, but as a civilian working to restore damaged communication towers and transport supplies across regions still recovering from the turmoil. Though the engines he operated lacked the power of the machines he had once flown, he discovered a new sense of purpose in the peaceful ascent above fields, rivers, and villages, striving to heal. The sky remained vast, but its meaning had transformed. It no longer represented a realm of conflict. It had become a reminder that humanity's greatest strength lay not in conquering the heavens, but in learning from the storms that had passed. Masaru often reflected upon the Thunderbolt, the storm of fire that had once dominated the Pacific. He no longer regarded it with fear or resentment. Instead, he viewed it as a symbol of the war's defining truth, that courage alone could not halt the tide of industrial power, yet human dignity could endure even in the face of overwhelming force. The memory of those who had fallen guided his thoughts, urging him to honor their sacrifices not through bitterness, but through the pursuit of understanding, compassion, and peace. In the quiet moments of evening, Masaru stood beneath the open sky and allowed the wind to brush against his face. The world had been reshaped, yet it continued to move forward. From that enduring motion, he drew a final lesson. The storms of war may burn, roar, and devastate, but they do not possess the power to extinguish the human spirit. Lieutenant Masaru Hayashi did not witness the final collapse of the airfield he had defended for so long. When his aircraft descended in a spiraling drift through dense cloud, he prepared for the end with steady resolve. Yet fate, in its unpredictable mercy, intervened. His damaged fighter crashed into a thick grove of coastal trees far from the main battle zone. The impact tore apart the wings, shattered the nose, and hurled Masaru forward with brutal force. Darkness claimed him before he could understand that he had survived. He awoke hours later, beneath a muted sky, surrounded by broken branches and the scorched remains of his aircraft. Pain surged through his body with every movement, yet his mind remained clear. He dragged himself away from the wreckage, fearful that leaking fuel might ignite at any moment. When he finally collapsed against the base of a tree, he listened to the distant rumble of explosions echoing across the landscape. The airfield was being destroyed. His home during the war, the place where he had formed bonds stronger than steel, had fallen beneath the storm of fire that had swept through the sky. Local villagers discovered him the following morning. They approached cautiously, uncertain whether he remained alive. When they realized he still breathed, they carried him to a secluded shelter hidden within the dense hills. Masaru drifted in and out of consciousness as they treated his wounds with the limited supplies they possessed. The faces around him revealed the hardships civilians endured: thin cheeks, weary eyes, and hands worn from labor. They spoke softly, as though sound itself had grown fragile in a world shaped by constant loss. Several weeks passed before Masaru regained enough strength to walk unaided. During that time, the villagers shared what news they gathered from passing travelers. The empire's hold over distant territories crumbled, cities suffered under relentless bombing, and food shortages consumed entire regions. Masaru listened with a quiet ache in his chest. He had known that defeat loomed, but hearing the full extent of the destruction stripped away the final remnants of hope that the war might reach a tolerable conclusion. Even after gaining mobility, Masaru remained concealed. Patrols moved unpredictably across the region, and any surviving military personnel risked immediate capture. The villagers protected him not out of obligation, but because they believed no one should suffer alone. Masaru repaid their kindness through small tasks, despite his lingering injuries. He fetched water from nearby streams, repaired damaged tools, and assisted elderly residents with simple chores. In these quiet acts, he rediscovered a form of purpose that did not rely upon engines, weapons, or battle formations. One evening, an elderly farmer invited Masaru to sit beside a small fire outside his home. The flames flickered gently, casting warm light across the man's weathered face. After a long silence, the farmer asked Masaru a question that pierced through the layers of restraint he had built around his heart. "Do you believe the sky will ever belong to peace again?" Masaru did not answer immediately. He gazed upward, studying the dark canopy above them. The stars appeared faint, veiled by drifting smoke from distant fires. He thought of the roaring engines, the burning tracers, the men who vanished in moments of blinding violence. He thought of youth spent mastering the art of flight, only to see the sky transformed into a theater of overwhelming industrial might. Finally, he spoke with quiet honesty. "I believe the sky will remember everything, and because it remembers, peace will come only when we accept how much we have lost." The farmer nodded, absorbing those words without judgment. The two men sat in contemplative silence until the fire faded into glowing embers. As the weeks continued, rumors of surrender spread through the hills. Some villagers dismissed them as enemy propaganda. Others believed the conflict had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. Masaru felt the truth settling over him even before official confirmation arrived. The empire's strength had been stretched beyond its limits. No amount of courage could reverse the tides that industrial power and unrelenting strategy had turned against them. The announcement of surrender reached Masaru on a humid afternoon. A traveling merchant passed through the village, carrying a small radio that had survived the chaos. When the broadcast crackled through the speaker, the villagers gathered in stunned silence. The emperor's voice, steady yet laden with sorrow, declared that the war had ended. Masaru closed his eyes as the full weight of those words washed over him. Relief mingled with grief. The struggle he had devoted his life to had come to its conclusion, but the cost of that conclusion reached into every corner of the nation and every chamber of his heart. In the days that followed, Masaru confronted the question that confronted every surviving soldier: what role remained for them in a world reshaped by defeat? The identity he had carried through the war, the identity built around flight, duty, and sacrifice, felt suspended in limbo. He no longer possessed an aircraft, a squadron, or a mission. He possessed only the fractured remains of memory and the uncertain path that now lay ahead. The villagers encouraged him to return home. They believed his family would need him, and he would need them. Masaru agreed. With the assistance of a passing convoy transporting displaced civilians, he began the long journey back to the mainland. The route carried him past ruined stations, burned fields, and shattered towns. Everywhere he looked, he saw the unmistakable imprint of the war's devastation. Yet amid the ruins, he also witnessed signs of resilience, as people rebuilt homes, cleared debris, and shared what little they possessed. By the time he reached his hometown, Masaru felt changed in ways he could hardly articulate. The war had altered the landscape of his nation, but it had also reshaped the inner landscape of every survivor. He understood now that endurance extended beyond the cockpit and beyond the battlefield. It continued within the quiet determination to rebuild, to heal, and to restore humanity, where destruction had left its deepest scars. The final battle that defined Lieutenant Masaru Hayashi's wartime journey arrived beneath a sky thick with monsoon clouds. The air felt heavy, as though the atmosphere itself sensed the conclusion drawing near. Supply lines had nearly collapsed. Fuel reserves approached exhaustion, and the command staff delivered their final orders with solemn restraint. Masaru knew that this mission would determine little in the broader scope of the conflict, yet he also understood that turning away from it would betray the men who had shared his burdens for so long. Duty, stripped of ambition and illusion, had become the last remaining anchor of his identity. The airfield buzzed with warning sirens as scouts reported incoming enemy formations. The approaching aircraft included bombers protected by the formidable Thunderbolts whose presence had reshaped every dimension of aerial combat. The officers instructed the pilots to intercept the escort fighters, delaying them long enough for anti-aircraft positions to engage the bombers. Masaru listened to the briefing in complete silence. He recognized the near impossibility of the task, yet he felt no fear. His emotional transformation had carved a new stillness within him. He accepted the mission not as an act of defiance, but as a final gesture of devotion toward the men and the homeland that had shaped his life. He rose into the sky with a small unit of weary pilots, each aircraft trembling slightly from the strain of constant use. As they ascended through the thick clouds, flashes of lightning illuminated the vast retreating landscape below. Masaru felt the wind buffet his wings, and he gripped the controls with a steady determination that surprised even him. His aircraft no longer felt like an extension of glory or aspiration. It felt like a companion in the shared act of perseverance. The moment they broke through the upper layer of cloud, they saw the enemy, a wall of thunderbolts, advance toward them with solemn inevitability. Their engines roared with the deep, resonant fury of storms imprisoned within steel. The formation moved with the unity of a single colossal organism. Beneath those wings, the bombers followed in methodical procession, prepared to deliver the final blows against the remaining defenses. Masaru signaled to his unit. They fanned out, forming a loose defensive arc. The space between the two forces contracted, filled with the tension of countless unspoken memories, sacrifices, and hopes. The first exchange erupted in a blinding torrent of fire. Thunderbolt guns unleashed their molten tracers with devastating accuracy, tearing through the Japanese formation. Masaru rolled sharply, evading one burst only to find another slicing past his fuselage. His aircraft shuddered under the impact of glancing hits, yet it remained airborne. He engaged a Thunderbolt directly, diving past its flank and firing a controlled burst. The round sparked across its armored skin, leaving only faint scorch marks. The American pilot responded with calm precision, pulling into a wide arc that positioned him behind Masaru. Masaru felt the familiar surge of danger, yet instead of panic, a profound clarity washed over him. He executed a sharp maneuver that forced the Thunderbolt to overshoot. For a moment, the sky opened around him in a fragile pocket of calm. Below, the bombers unleashed their cargo. The distant earth erupted in rolling waves of fire. Masaru knew the destruction signaled the end of their airfield. Yet he also knew that his goal had been achieved. The delay had allowed some ground positions to fire upon the bombers before the final strike reached them. His engine began to falter. Smoke seeped into the cockpit. Masaru guided his failing aircraft toward the cloud layer, allowing the grey expanse to envelop him. He felt an unexpected sense of peace. The war's outcome no longer rested upon his shoulders. He had given everything he possessed, not for victory, but for honor. As the engine finally failed, and the world tilted into silence, Masaru accepted the end with the quiet dignity of a man who had faced an unstoppable storm and remained unbroken in spirit. The turning point in Lieutenant Masaru Hayashi's inner journey emerged during a mission that began without any hint of significance. It started as a routine interception order, the sort of assignment he had flown countless times throughout the long and exhausting conflict. The early morning light had not yet risen above the jagged horizon when he stepped toward his aircraft, guided by dim lanterns that cast trembling shadows across the worn metal fuselage. The air carried the familiar scent of oil and dust, yet something within Masaru felt unsteady, as though his spirit recognized a shift that his mind could not yet define. The briefing had warned of enemy fighter formations passing near their sector. Masaru knew that these formations likely included the enormous Thunderbolt machines whose devastating power haunted the thoughts of every pilot on the airfield. Despite that knowledge, he climbed into his cockpit with the same disciplined resolve that had guided him for years. His fingers moved across the instruments, the engine roared to life, and the aircraft rolled down the runway toward the indifferent sky. As Masaru ascended through layers of cloud, he heard the trembling radio voices of younger pilots who sought reassurance. He offered steady guidance, though he could feel the weight of responsibility pressing upon him. Above the clouds, the sunlight spread across a vast, silent expanse that felt detached from the world's suffering. For a brief moment, Masaru felt an echo of the serenity he had known during his earliest days in flight. That fleeting calm vanished when he saw dark shapes forming in the distance. The American fighters approached with purposeful momentum, their immense frames shimmering with reflected sunlight. Masaru recognized the broad wings, the enormous engines, and the lethal barrels of their heavy guns. The Thunderbolts flew in disciplined formation, radiating a sense of unstoppable force. He signaled to his unit, urging them to maintain cohesion, yet he sensed their fear through the static-filled replies. The engagement erupted with overwhelming violence. Trails of molten tracers cut across the sky, and the first exchange shattered the fragile order of Masaru's formation. Two inexperienced pilots disappeared in expanding spheres of flame before they could maneuver. Masaru dove sharply, feeling the crushing force press against his chest as he attempted to evade the sweeping arcs of enemy fire. The Thunderbolts descended with thunderous authority, each burst from their guns carving through the air with terrifying precision. During one desperate turn, Masaru found himself aligned behind a Thunderbolt that had broken from its formation. He squeezed the trigger, sending a string of rounds toward the immense aircraft. Sparks erupted across its armored frame, yet the machine continued forward as though untouched. The pilot inside executed a controlled roll, swung behind Masaru and unleashed a torrent of fire that sliced past his wing with the searing heat of a forge. Masaru barely escaped by diving into a cloud layer that swallowed him in shadow. Inside that temporary sanctuary, his breath trembled. He felt the boundaries of his previous beliefs collapsing. The war had taught him that courage could shape survival, yet this moment revealed that courage alone had no power against the industrial magnitude embodied by the Thunderbolt. As Masaru steadied his breathing, he sensed something shifting within him. A new understanding formed, not born from surrender, but from a painful clarity that the war's outcome extended far beyond the valor of individual pilots. Emerging from the cloud, he witnessed the final moments of a comrade whose aircraft spiraled downward in burning fragments. The sight struck Masaru with overwhelming force. He had known that man had listened to his stories, had shared quiet meals with him. Now the sky devoured him in a violent flare of orange and black. In that instant, Masaru felt the world around him narrow into a singular truth. He could no longer frame this conflict as a contest of noble warriors. It had become a relentless collision between human lives and machines forged with unparalleled industrial strength. Yet this realization did not extinguish his resolve. Instead, it ignited a deeper, more solemn form of courage. Masaru understood that he now flew not to claim victory, but to protect the final remnants of the world he cherished. The men beside him, the families waiting at home, the fragile humanity that persisted within the ruins of an unwinnable struggle. He no longer sought personal triumph. He sought dignity in the face of overwhelming force, and purpose in the act of enduring. As he guided his damaged aircraft back toward the distant airfield, the sky glowed with fading sunlight. Masaru felt a profound transformation settle within him. The Thunderbolt had shown him the immensity of the world's changing tides, yet it had also revealed the depth of his own resilience. He did not return with victory. He returned with a renewed understanding of sacrifice, loyalty, and the cost of confronting a storm far greater than himself. The airfield where Lieutenant Masaru Hayashi spent his days no longer resembled the proud installation he had first joined. During his earliest assignments, the grounds had felt orderly, alive with purpose, filled with disciplined routines and polished machines glinting beneath the sun. Mechanics moved with confident precision, officers conducted briefings steeped in certainty, and the pilots themselves believed they represented an unbreakable shield above the Empire's distant holdings. Now the same terrain felt worn, strained, and burdened by a conflict that had grown far beyond anyone's expectations. Dust drifted across cracked concrete, spare parts arrived irregularly, and the once vibrant atmosphere had dimmed into a constant mixture of fatigue, tension, and quiet dread. Each morning began long before the sun's first light touched the horizon. Masaru rose from a thin mattress inside a cramped barracks that echoed through the night with the restless movements of exhausted men. The scent of oil, sweat, and damp uniforms lingered everywhere. Pilots dressed in silence, each man aware that any given dawn might carry his final ascent. They gathered in the briefing hall, where officers outlined reconnaissance reports, enemy movements, and fuel allocations that grew smaller with every passing week. The tone of these meetings had changed. Where enthusiastic certainty once held command, Now there stood a sober acceptance that the enemy dominated the skies with machines that exceeded their own in nearly every measurable way. The mechanics who tended Masaru's aircraft worked with admirable dedication, despite their dwindling supplies. They salvaged metal from wrecks, forged improvised components, and coaxed fading engines into temporary service. Masaru often stood nearby, watching their hands move with a careful determination that reminded him of artisans preserving a craft with vanishing resources. The men spoke little, for they knew each machine they revived would soon face the overwhelming power of the Thunderbolt. Still, they treated every aircraft as though it might carry the turning point of the war. Their persistence offered a quiet form of courage that Masaru deeply respected. Flight training had become a rare luxury. Fuel reserves were tightly rationed, and inexperienced pilots received only the bare minimum instruction before joining combat missions. Masaru noticed their anxious expressions as they studied maps and diagrams, attempting to memorize maneuvers they rarely had the chance to practice. Many were barely old enough to shave. They looked to Masaru for guidance, believing his early successes marked him as a figure of authority. He did his best to offer encouragement, but the truth hung heavily within him. The enemy's machines possessed such overwhelming power that even the most skilled veterans struggled to survive. These young men, fragile yet hopeful, stepped into cockpits with hearts full of patriotic duty, but skills sharpened far too briefly. Meals were simple affairs, consisting primarily of rice, pickled vegetables, and thin broths that offered more warmth than sustenance. Masaru often sat beside his closest comrades, men with whom he had once shared laughter and bold predictions about the future. Their conversations had changed as well. Instead of discussing strategy or ambition, they exchanged memories of home, speaking of orchards, mountain trails, or childhood festivals lit by lantern light. These recollections served as anchors, reminders that a world existed beyond the relentless demands of the airfield. Masaru cherished those moments, for they softened the harshness of each day and allowed the men to feel human again. During afternoons without scheduled flights, Masaru walked along the perimeter of the airfield, absorbing the sensory tapestry of war. Trucks rattled past carrying ammunition or wounded soldiers. Medical tents filled with quiet groans and whispered prayers. The smell of burning fuel drifted from the maintenance sheds. Occasionally he paused near the flight line, where the shadows of grounded aircraft stretched across the ground like reminders of wings that might never rise again. He studied the battered shapes of machines returned from missions bearing scars of combat, torn panels, bullet-riddled wings, scorched metal. Each wound told a story of desperate evasions, narrow escapes, or final moments that ended in smoke and flame. Despite the difficulty of their situation, the pilots maintained rituals that lent structure to their lives. Every sunset brought a brief gathering near the edge of the runway, where they stood quietly and watched the sky change color. Some believed it honored fallen comrades. Others simply needed the reminder that beauty still existed in a world dominated by destruction. Masaru found solace in these sunsets. The vast shifting hues helped him remember the feeling of peaceful flight from his youth, before war had transformed the sky into a battlefield. Night descended heavily upon the airfield. Lanterns flickered along narrow paths, and the sounds of distant artillery murmured across the horizon like an approaching tide. Masaru lay awake many nights, listening to the rhythmic breathing of his fellow pilots in the barracks. His mind replayed encounters with the Thunderbolt, the overwhelming sound of its engine, and the fiery torrent unleashed by its heavy guns. He struggled to quiet his thoughts, for sleep often invited dreams in which the sky burned, and the earth trembled beneath the onslaught of molten tracers. He longed for the simpler challenges of early flight, when skill determined survival, rather than industrial superiority. On rare occasions, Masaru received letters from home. They described the changing conditions within the mainland, the rationing, the bombings, the relentless anxiety felt by civilians. His younger sister wrote with remarkable optimism, encouraging him to remain strong and assuring him that the family awaited his return. Her words comforted him, yet he sensed the strain hidden between the lines. He folded each letter carefully and carried them inside his flight jacket during missions, drawing strength from the thought that someone far away still believed in his survival. The airfield existed in this fragile state, worn yet enduring, fearful yet determined, diminished yet unwilling to surrender its final purpose. Every day reminded Masaru that he stood within the narrowing space between duty and inevitability. The Thunderbolt loomed constantly in his thoughts, not merely as an enemy machine but as a symbol of everything that had shifted in the war. While he continued performing his responsibilities with unwavering discipline, he felt the growing weight of a future shaped by forces greater than any single pilot. Yet amid the strain, Masaru found moments of quiet clarity. The camaraderie between pilots, the dedication of the mechanics, the perseverance of the officers, and the memory of the homes they defended, formed a constellation of small lights that pushed back against the surrounding darkness. These fragments of humanity sustained him, reminding him that even in the midst of overwhelming danger, life persevered through gestures of dignity, loyalty, and hope. Each day he rose to face the sky, not because he believed victory awaited, but because he felt bound to protect the men beside him and the families who held their breath far beyond the horizon. It was this enduring sense of connection that carried him through the grueling rhythm of life on the airfield, even as the storm of fire drew ever closer. The rise of the Thunderbolt in the Pacific theater did not occur by accident, nor did it emerge from a single moment of inspiration. It was the culmination of years of experimentation, industrial resolve, and an evolving understanding of what air superiority demanded in a conflict that expanded across entire oceans. When engineers in the United States first conceived the aircraft, they envisioned a machine that could survive the brutal realities of long-range combat and still strike with overwhelming force. The result was a fighter unlike anything that had come before it, a towering frame wrapped around a massive radial engine, armed with 8 heavy machine guns and capable of absorbing damage that would have destroyed smaller, lighter designs. In the early stages of the conflict, Japanese fighters such as the Zero held a clear advantage in maneuverability. Their light frames and refined aerodynamics allowed them to twist and climb with unmatched agility, which initially humbled Allied pilots who relied on tactics that did not align with the realities of the Pacific environment. Masaru Hayashi had joined the Air Force during this earlier period, when the Empire's rapid expansion created a sense of inevitability. Japanese pilots were celebrated as exemplars of precision, discipline, and spirit. The Zero's early victories amplified these national convictions, reinforcing the belief that superior skill and devotion would ensure continued triumph. However, the war's industrial dimension soon revealed its inescapable power. American factories began producing aircraft at a staggering pace, each new model embodying hard lessons learned over battlefields and coastlines. The P-47 entered service first in Europe, where its ruggedness and firepower proved invaluable against German fighters and ground targets. Pilots admired its strength, and ground crews valued its resilience. Yet it was the shift toward the Pacific theater that would transform its reputation into something mythic. By the time the Thunderbolt reached the islands and atolls where Masaru flew, Japanese resources were already strained, fuel shortages, diminishing pilot training hours, and a decline in experienced personnel weakened squadrons that had once embodied the pride of the Empire. In contrast, American units arrived with improved logistics, abundant supplies, and thoroughly trained aviators who rotated frequently enough to maintain both morale and effectiveness. The Thunderbolt's immense engine allowed it to climb rapidly, dive with crushing momentum, and engage or disengage at will. Its heavy machine guns delivered a volume of fire that stunned those who faced them for the first time. Japanese intelligence reports began describing the new fighter as a monstrous presence, capable of enduring hits that would have shattered other aircraft. Ground observers spoke of runs in which the Thunderbolt descended like a hammer, its guns unleashing torrents of molten tracers that chewed through fortifications, vehicles, and aircraft lined along exposed runways. Villages near military installations described the sky streaking with fiery lines as American fighters strafed supply convoys or ammunition dumps. Some observers likened the effect to a rainstorm composed entirely of burning metal. Masaru heard these accounts circulate through the narrow corridors of his airfield barracks. Fellow pilots debated whether such descriptions were exaggerated, born from the fear and exhaustion of units stationed closer to the front. Yet each week brought new confirmations. Squadrons that had once held their positions with confidence now sent back grim reports of catastrophic losses. Encounters that had previously unfolded with a sense of tactical clarity were now overshadowed by the unpredictable violence the Thunderbolt introduced into the sky. The Empire's leadership urged its pilots to meet the challenge with unwavering loyalty. Propaganda emphasized spirit, sacrifice, and the righteousness of defending the homeland. But behind closed doors, officers discussed the harsh arithmetic of the changing conflict. The industrial might of the enemy was overwhelming, and the machines that now crossed the Pacific represented a technological tide that could not be reversed through discipline alone. Within this shifting landscape, Masaru found himself standing at the threshold of an era defined not by the swift duels he once envisioned, but by the crushing weight of a war machine that operated on scales beyond the reach of individual valor. The Thunderbolt symbolized the transformation of air combat from an expression of personal mastery into a display of industrial force. For Masaru, this realization marked the beginning of an inner conflict that would shape every mission he flew from that moment forward.